The Ghost at the Foot of the Stairs. Written and narrated by David Pickering.
Well, well, here we are. Sit yourself down, do. I hope you enjoyed the cutlets. My old cook has always done me proud up here at the Hall. It's not often she has company to cook for, I'm afraid. Eh? More brandy? Of course, dear fellow. Help yourself, help yourself. Splendid fire, isn't it? I had Benson lay it up for us earlier before he went off to join in the Jubilee celebrations. God bless the old lady. What a pity Albert died so young, leaving her to go on alone all these years. But never mind, never mind. Nothing like a roaring blaze on a winter's night. Pull your chair up a bit closer, or you won't feel the benefit. That's it. Capital. Why, you ask me, have I called you up here tonight? The fact is, I am looking for a new place, and I understand you may be able to find one for me. As you may have heard, I have recently put the Hall up for sale. Why? Well, might you ask, indeed? It's a building with such a long history, with such a wealth of stories in its stones and timbers, a building of such imposing yet appealing character, and with so many entertaining architectural features. What's that you say? The staircase. Yes, it is rather impressive, isn't it? Though I rarely go upstairs much these days, but we'll come to that. I think you'll agree that it is possibly the most interesting, if not the most ancient, structure in the whole town. I must be mad, you're thinking, to give it up. Quite mad. But I tell you that is exactly what I should become if I stayed here. Raving mad. If you really want to know why I'm selling up and moving out, the answer, I must tell you with the deepest regret, is just this: ghost stories. You may not know this, but the collection and reading of ghost stories was formerly my most cherished indulgence. Now it has become my most terrifying nightmare. But I'd run ahead of myself. Help yourself to the brandy while I furnish you with my sad history. Some people blight you throughout your life, popping up unexpectedly and always without welcome at its various stages. In my case, the person in question was one Cedric Blitherstrop, one of the Somerset Blitherstrops. You probably know the family. No? Oh, well, you're not missing much. I first met Cedric Blitherstrop, oh, cursed hour, while but a schoolboy. By unfortunate accident, both he and I were dispatched by our respective loving parents to the same house in the same school, where the relevant authorities compounded the error by placing us both in the same dormitory and the same study. We had the same teachers, we played in the same teams, we sat at the same table at breakfast, luncheon, and dinner, we even shared the same bath times. For 5 long years there was no escaping the cloying company of that young blister. What was wrong with the company of Cedric Blitherstrop? What was right with the company of Cedric Blitherstrop? If ever there was a more tedious, querulous, and pernickety character to play God's earth, well, I have yet to meet him. I confess it, I found the blighter irritating. What made the situation worse was that he seemed to find my company fascinating. He couldn't get enough of it. When I walked to class in the morning, there he was behind me, tripping over my heels. When I basked in the sunlight on the house lawn, blissfully neglecting my studies, it was always his shadow that got in the way. When, in my exasperation, I sought solitude at the keyboard of the house piano, I was a dab hand at popular music hall tunes of the day, I'd turn around and there he'd be, listening with a disapproving expression on his fat, stupid face. Did I mention that he was fat? Well, he was. Not fat, maybe, but plump, in an unsightly and self-satisfied way, especially around the face. But that's by the by. The young Cedric and I were never going to find much in common. The many wearisome conversations that took place between us only served to emphasize the lack of sympathy between our disparate natures. If I ventured any opinion or observation, however innocent, Cedric gnawed at it like the mouse he was, and nibbled it to shreds with his meddlesome objections. How I tired of his persistent wheedling manner, with his "I think you'll find," and his "You may say that, but—" He had all the charm of a minor clerk in Her Majesty's Board of Inland Revenue, which, uninterestingly enough, was what he later became. We agreed on nothing, whether it was schoolwork or politics, or which was the best flavour in a bag of sweets. It would be wearying beyond belief to repeat the many topics upon which we clashed. It will suffice to mention just one, on a subject of some relevance to us now, that of ghost stories. Even at that young age I had already discovered the delight of the English ghost story, with its delicious combination of anticipation and horror. I loved to curl up in some dark corner and scare myself half to death with tales of spectres, ghouls, and demons, losing myself in a world of gloomy, ivy-clad ruins and moonlit cathedral closes. Cedric, as you have no doubt guessed, would have none of it. "You and your ghost stories," he'd scoff, his pink jowls flapping. "There's no such thing as ghosts. It's a scientific fact. If there were such a thing, tell me why no one's ever taken a convincing photographic plate of one, or persuaded one to give a newspaper interview. Why haven't you or I ever seen one?" And so on and so forth ad infinitum. It was largely in the desperate hope of eluding Cedric Blitherstrop that I finally did some work and managed to pass the examinations necessary to make my escape from school to university, where I am happy to report my nemesis did not follow. However, within a month of coming down from the said university 3 years later, and just starting out in the city, I was appalled to find myself once more thrown into his company as members of the same London club. My first thought was to resign my membership at once and find another club, but it was a comfortable place with soft leather armchairs, an excellent cellar, and an agreeable aroma of good cigars. On reflection, I decided I was damned if I was going to let someone like Cedric Blitherstrop drive me out. I resolved to put up with him, and stayed. I cannot tell you how many times over the years that followed I came to doubt that my decision was the right one. Evening after evening, that ass Blitherstrop, growing fatter and more stupid with the passing years, would sidle up to the table where I was trying to ignore him in the company of more congenial friends, and insinuate himself into the conversation until there was no option but to acknowledge our acquaintance. He showed no sign of improvement, either in manner or appearance, and still lacked entirely that nice sensitivity that would warn more tactful souls that their continued presence was unlooked for. In fact, he had got worse, as his new career as a tax official schooled him further, as if he needed it, in the doleful science of persistence. Cedric's opinions and view of life remained as contrary to mine as ever, and his scorn of ghost stories was even more pronounced. "You're not still reading that piffle?" he mocked one November evening as I sat with a copy of Sheridan Le Fanu before me. "I don't know how you can waste your time with it." "It's not piffle," I retorted. "It's literature." "It is piffle," he insisted. "All ghost stories are, and I'm very glad to say I've never read a single one." "If you haven't read one, how do you know they're piffle?" I countered. That caught him. "Because," he sputtered, "because all sensible people know they're piffle." "No, they don't. I don't think they're piffle." "Well, they are." "No, they're not." "Yes, they are." "No, they're not." I won't bore you further with the intricacies of the arguments to and fro. Suffice it to say that the more Cedric Blitherstrop blustered and grew red in his fat face, the more it finally began to dawn on me the real reason why he had such objections to my favourite reading matter. I have already told you that Cedric Blitherstrop, for all his carping and criticism, was essentially a timid man. Now I saw the real reason why he detested such tales, why he had always detested them. It was this: he was quite simply terrified of them. I make no excuse for myself when I say I took full advantage of this truth as soon as it became apparent to me. I am not proud of it. Now I knew that my tormentor was scared of ghost stories, and thus presumably of anything that smacked of the supernatural, I immediately took possession of the higher ground, rhetorically if not morally, and challenged him to send his armies up to me. "So, you've never read a ghost story?" I ruminated, settling myself deeper in my armchair and waving the Lefanu idly before me. "They're not for everyone, of course, only for the hardier sort of reader. You wouldn't want young children to read them, for instance, or nuns, or expectant mothers." There are not many occasions when the word florid is of much use in day-to-day conversation, but I am happy to say that this was one of those rare occasions when it did very nicely. Cedric Blitherstrop went florid. In fact, the more I applied my barbs, the more florid and puce, another suddenly useful word, he became. He flustered and quibbled, and then positively gibbered when I shrugged and suggested he stick to romantic fiction or memoirs of the clergy. At last, to my grim satisfaction, he could take it no longer. "Very well, then," he snapped, and bear in mind this was in the hearing of a dozen or more other fellows in the club's smoking-room. "Give me the blessed thing, and I'll read it this very night." "What, this?" I inquired innocently, indicating the book. "Yes, that." "Don't feel obliged, my dear fellow, if you don't want to." "Give it to me," he snarled, and with this he positively snatched the volume from my hand. "And tomorrow," he sneered in my face, "I'll tell you exactly what I think of such puerile rubbish once and for all." It is just possible, from the various clues that were left to us and a degree of imagination, to piece together the train of events that unfolded that fateful November evening after Cedric Blitherstrop stormed out of the club, with Sheridan Le Fanu's collected ghost stories tucked tightly under his arm. It must have taken him nearly an hour to stamp in an ill temper back to his modest home in the suburbs, where it appears he angrily removed his coat, savagely stoked up the sitting-room fire, and impatiently prepared himself a bachelor's supper of bread, cheese, and pickle. It will come as no surprise to you to learn that his increasingly corpulent figure and pusillanimous manner had failed entirely over the years to attract a wife. I have never married either, but have never wanted for the company of the fairer sex, you understand. At length the time came for the man to face what finally had to be faced. I can picture him now, lowering himself into his favourite armchair before the hearth in his cheerless parlour, adjusting the cushions, and then, with a scowl, picking up the Le Fanu and with a trembling hand opening it. I can see how he licks his lips, which are suddenly dry, and tastes for the first time that thrill of delicious, awful anticipation that only the English ghost story can provoke. Which tale does he choose to read first? We shall never know. There is no way either of knowing how far the fellow got with his reading that unlucky evening, or precisely what effect the story had on him. You must remember that, despite the fact that middle age was now rushing upon him, Cedric Blitherstrop had never once in his life been exposed to the raw power of a good ghost story. He was entirely unschooled in how to absorb the inevitable shock that such tales can have upon a sensitive nervous system. Let us imagine him as he starts to read. Doubtless, for all his protestations of scorn, the insidious spell of the master storyteller steals over him, lulling him, soothing him, and then fastening a steely grip on his imagination. Perhaps, as he reads, his taut nerves begin to play tricks on him. What is that sound? Did that curtain move? Is he imagining, or is something scratching behind the wooden waistcoating? Has that shadow behind the door changed somehow? And where is that icy draught coming from? Eventually it becomes too much, and whether he has reached the end of the story or not, let us be generous and assume he did make it to the last full stop, he decides that that is enough for his first night, and that it is time to retire to bed. He places the hateful book on a convenient table, hauls himself out of the chair, and, after banking up the fire, leaves the room, turning the light down as he goes. He exits the suddenly dark room a little more hurriedly than he is wont to do, and is startled at the lurch in his heart as the light dies. He collects himself, checks that the front door is securely locked, and then pads to the foot of the stairs. Try as he might, his mind is crammed with the dread details of the story he has just read. He struggles to maintain his composure as he places his foot on the first stair and turns down the hallway light. The dark into which the hallway is plunged fills him with alarm, and he hastens up the first 3 or 4 treads. All is strangely unfamiliar in the moonlight that pours down from the long window at the top of the staircase. A terrible fear creeps over him, and the horrid conviction enters his mind that he is not alone in the house. He is suddenly convinced that some awful, hideous thing has followed him from the parlour, and is lurking in the dark somewhere behind him, watching him. Catching his breath, he flattens himself against the wall, and forces himself to look back into the darkened hallway with its black recesses and impenetrable shadows. Nothing, but his sense of dread is still profound. He lifts his left foot up to the next tread, his eyes still fixed on the moonlit vacant space at the foot of the stairs. Still he sees nothing, but his mind is running out of control now, creating out of the shadows a terrifying, unseen creature, half shroud, half hair, with red eyes and skeletal hands, which reach forwards and upwards towards him. He whimpers and shakes his head to try to tear the image loose, but still it remains, clearer than ever. He lets out a moan of terror as his stumbling foot fails to gain the next stair. What did Cedric Blitherstrop see? We cannot know. But whatever he saw, or thought he saw, was enough to launch him with a sudden burst of speed up the remaining stairs. Unfortunately, it appears that as he reached the top stair, one of his feet caught on the carpet, causing him to lurch forwards and be propelled, with a great crashing of glass and wood, headfirst through the landing window. It would be a good thing if I could tell you that the wretched man's fall from that high second-floor window was stopped short when his jacket caught on a projecting drain-pipe, that he managed to interrupt his downward flight by grabbing hold of the ivy growing against the wall, that his precipitate descent ended in a blissfully soft landing in a deep cushion of dead leaves. But alas, I cannot. There was no convenient drain-pipe, no ivy against the wall, no heap of leaves below, only empty air, and finally, unavoidably in his path, a stout cast-iron railing with wicked upward-turned quatrefoil spikes. The horror those spikes wrought on poor Cedric Blitherstrop's head and body I will leave to your imagination. But believe me that whatever you are now picturing in your mind, well, it was at least twice as bad as that. The plump, punctured corpse was found the following morning by the postman as he delivered a packet of Dr. Allsop's amazing health-restoring tablets. I understand the man has had to be placed under the care of his doctor, and is unlikely ever to return to his work. Such was the impact of the dreadful scene upon his sensitive nature. News of my old schoolfellow's terrible demise only reached me 2 or 3 days later. As you might expect, I regretted his premature end without being exactly heartbroken. Privately, I was more concerned for the loss of the Lefanu, but of course it was hardly seemly to ask for it. The manner of Cedric Blitherstrop's death was undeniably mysterious. Imagine, killed by a ghost story. But what on earth, or out of it, had caused the ill-fated wretch to panic like that? Had he been deceived by the shadow cast by his own figure in the moonlight streaming through the landing window? Or had he been startled into panic by his own reflection in a mirror, perhaps? Once again, we shall never know. And, of course, there remains the unsettling possibility that there really was something that followed him to the foot of the stairs, something hideous, grinning, relentless. And now we come to the most dreadful part of the affair, the terrible happening that has robbed me forever of the greatest pleasure in life. I was decent enough to lay aside my favourite reading until the man was properly buried, naturally, but I was not about to let the doleful fate of Cedric Blitherstrop, of all people, stop me permanently from indulging in my most cherished pastime. Accordingly, about a week after the awful events I have already described, I settled myself in a comfortable spot in my own home, and took down a fine volume of ghost stories that I had been looking forward to reading for some time. I won't trouble you with the details of the delightful histories that I absorbed myself in over the next couple of hours, but must turn instead, reluctantly, to what happened when I closed my book and set off up the stairs for bed. I had barely turned out the hallway light and climbed up a couple of stairs when I became suddenly intensely aware of something, some presence, some spiritual entity immediately behind me, watching me from the foot of the stairs. I froze in terror. The house was entirely still around me. I strained my ears, but nothing on God's earth would have made me turn round to see my pursuer, because, almost in the same moment, I knew exactly what I would see. Him. The ghost of Cedric Blitherstrop. I could feel his eyes boring into my back, as though they would burn right into me and snatch out my heart. I cannot describe the dreadful feeling that overwhelmed me. I sensed his terrible fury, his implacable hatred, his hunger for revenge upon me, the man who had unwittingly brought about his untimely end. And all because I had made him read a ghost story. I don't know how long I stood there in my frozen state, but then the sound of a distant clock striking broke the spell. I summoned every last vestige of courage in me, and pounded up the stairs to the safety of my bedroom without ever once looking back. That is how it is with me now. If I so much as open a book of my beloved ghost stories, I find that as soon as I set off for bed, he is there, the ghost at the foot of the stairs, with the terrible, accusing, baleful eyes. And what terrifies me most is that one of these evenings I shall actually summon up the courage to look behind me and see him in all his hideous reality. I know he blames me for his abrupt departure from this world. That is why every evening he waits for me. He haunted me in life, and now he haunts me in death. So, I ask you, what will become of me? I cannot bear to give up my ghost stories, but equally I cannot bear the hideous visitations of this infernal trespasser. I cannot stay here, that's certain, for there is no shifting him with his heartless persistence. There's only one thing for it, my dear fellow, and I am resolved to do it. I must sell this place and move to, what do they call them? Some infernal Hindu word. Bungalow. Yes, that's it. A bungalow. That's what I want. If you know of one, a bungalow, I'd be most grateful. It doesn't matter how large or small it is, how new or old, how cheap or expensive, just so long as it does not have a single stair in it.
That was The Ghost at the Foot of the Stairs, written and narrated by David Pickering.